friends. Welcome back to the Applied Leadership Podcast. My name is Blaine Smith, and I'm joined, as always, by my good friend and business partner, Brandon Young. And we are two friends with one question, half an hour, and zero script. Brandon, we've got a good question today. It comes from our friend Mike Hutchings over at Combined Arms.
Nice.
For a little context, Mike is the CEO of a nonprofit organization that is growing rapidly and doing a lot of good work, especially in the veteran space. Mm-hmm. And the question revolves around this idea of sustainability for senior leaders. And to paraphrase this question, it is, how can a leader help to distribute some of the heaviness of being kind of in charge of the organization? Meaning, one person, as good as they may be, can't just sustain the full stress, the full weight of a company on their back indefinitely. Eventually, that's gonna fall short, and we're gonna come crashing down. So, can we take other people within the organization, perhaps other senior leaders, and give them an opportunity to really own some of that? I hate to say own some of the stress, but own some of the responsibility. And maybe it's going to meetings, maybe it's doing other things, all of which we can talk about. But I think that really is the question. How do we set ourselves up so we can be sustainable and effective for the long haul, which is kind of our whole jam here? Mm-hmm. If we feel the responsibility and the weight maybe sitting at the top of the org chart of a division or of a company. So lots to chew on there. Some ground we've covered in the past, but I think some fresh perspective here might be helpful, given that we're hearing some version of this question from quite a lot of folks around the country.
Yeah, we really are in a host of different sectors. And I think it really cuts to that axiom that you hear all the time, that leadership is a lonely place. And we would start off by suggesting that we reject that notion. Leadership does not have to be a lonely place. And establishing the right kind of leadership team is, I think, where it starts. I think we want to be really thoughtful about the form of the team, naturally following the functional aspects that are required from each of those teammates and each of those divisions. Blaine, you often say form follows function. I think that's kind of where it starts. This is the classic Jim Collins of, get the right people on the bus, get them in the right seat on the bus. And I think that once you have that and you've built in some of that connective tissue so that people are not just thinking, vertically, but they're also thinking horizontally, or at least considering horizontally, is, I think, maybe where it starts. So when we're thinking about like the stress that we have right now, trying to get as far ahead of it as possible, I think does begin with assembling that team and then really being diligent about building some of that connective tissue. And then I think we're having a conversation a lot around delegation. How do we delegate certain aspects of the business? But I find that this question is, I think it's a little less oriented around the functional execution. And I think it's a little bit more oriented around the functional communication, maybe is a way to say it, is the cascading of the communications, the consistency of the communications, the consistent drumbeat of the vision and the mission and some of the cultural aspects of what make us tick as an organization. And that's why I think it's a little bit less about like the discrete functional areas that each of these leaders are responsible for, and more about how they actually think in that horizontal fashion and how they are helping to share the load of carrying the message, the load of receiving some of the natural feedback, because a lot of the organizations that we work with that are going through some brand of growth, change, or adversity, there's a lot in there. There's a lot of human dynamic stuff that naturally kind of bubbles up because people generally care about what they do. They show up. They want to do a good job. They also want to know that they're investing their considerable time and talents into an organization that is kind of going somewhere and doing something and making an impact. And I think that what we see often is that change naturally hits. It brings about that sense of uncertainty. People get a little bit concerned. And some of these things start to bubble up throughout the organization. And I think that is where it's so critical that there is a distribution of leaders that are willing to kind of receive some of those initial bubblings, but also reinforce some of the communication of the vision, the mission, and the goals, and why we're doing what we're doing. Why are we making some of these changes? Why are we experiencing some of the things that we're experiencing? And what are we trying to do to be most proactive in championing the mission, taking care of our people, and making an impact in the world? Those are some initial thoughts on the topic.
Yeah, I really like that. I mean, we don't want to encourage any CEO or senior leader to kind of insulate themselves from what's really going on. But I think that's different than what you're describing, which is really empowering your peers and your subordinates to kind of answer questions, solve things, and not have every problem make its way up to the senior leader. I think that's a different thing and needs to be the case. I'll back all the way up here and say that I think this largely has to do with the attitude and the disposition of that leader. Because what I see a lot of is senior leaders that wish they had less stress, that wish other people could do more, and that they weren't carrying the full burden, yet they're very hesitant to relinquish control over a creative decision or important meeting or things along those lines. And I think this stems from two major places. It could stem from the people on the bus dynamic that you described, Brandon. Too often we see senior leaders, founders especially, who just simply do not surround themselves with other A players. They're just not comfortable for whatever reason having other A players right around them. And if you're not willing to have people around you that are better than you, that challenge you, that could step in for you in an important meeting, you're just never going to get the relief you're looking for. So it starts with you have to have the maturity and the humility to bring people in to be on your leadership team that could stand in for you if they had to, at least in a limited fashion, right? There's that old saying that A players hire A players and B players hire C players. Mm-hmm. Right. So don't let your own insecurities get in the way of getting great people around you. So that's the first part. And then, of course, the second part is once you have those people around you, you do have to trust them. You do have to be willing to delegate that thing. You do have to live sometimes with an outcome that's not quite exactly what you would have done, but is good enough to keep us moving because that's what they would have done. And that rep's going to help them. So yes, I can totally sympathize and empathize with wanting to spread out some of that mental load and stress and that real ownership that we feel as senior leaders. But I think before we go too far in any tactics, we've got to put it right on that same leader who's asking for it and say, have you done what you need to do to surround yourself with really high quality people? Do you have a deep bench of folks that you can trust? And are you actively giving them opportunities to step into these big moments and really have some ownership over this? Because if we don't do that, then we've just got zero shot. And all of the tactics and frameworks and stuff in the world that we could give people around empowerment and accountability and ownership and all of that, they're just going to fall flat because we simply don't have the people and the culture to put that stuff into live action.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you're making there. And I think what happens, or I should say, we have seen that if you have a bench, if you're one of the kind of leaders that has a bench where you're not quite sure, if you've got those A players there, give them the chance to confirm or deny whether or not you do. Give them the chance to empower them, equip them, and give them the opportunity to carry some of that water, for lack of a better term. And I really like how you pointed out the fact that it might not be exactly how you would have done it, but that's okay. Because if it's always exactly how you would have done it, then you probably are an A player or maybe a B player who has C's, or maybe you haven't hired other A's. And I think that that's really important to note. I think the other thing that's important to note is that we see very commonly that there are people in organizations that are just have like a lot of stored up potential energy that could be those folks who can bring fresh ideas, carry some of that water, reach a little bit. And I think we need to look for those people, because it can't just be the C-suite, for lack of a better term, regardless. I mean, I think first and foremost, what we're saying is that it can't just be the CEO, the executive director. You need to help kind of insulate around you with some of those key talent, and not isolate and be kind of like the long pole that's holding everything up. Find some of those other moorings and everything like that. But if you also have that, it can't just be those folks as well. Let's go a layer deeper. What are some of the mid-level leaders? What are some of the frontline leaders? Maybe what are some of the all-star players that are out there that are individual contributors that maybe we can also include them in some of these kind of discussions? I'm not saying that we include them in all of the discussions, but when you have, I think a lot of this starts to come about around not just strategy, but also culture. Kind of the blending of the strategy and culture. And I think we have a lot of culture carriers at all echelons of the organization. And when we're talking about kind of distributing some of the mental load, for lack of a better term, or the emotional load, maybe, I think we can find people at all levels that we can enlist into the process and ask to help champion some things in a way that does not feel kind of manipulative, but inclusive.
Yeah, absolutely. I've never been in a decent organization where there weren't people who were willing and even eager to take on a bit more responsibility or to move up and really own something. Those people exist. You just have to find them and get them pointed in the right direction. As long as you've got good people around, they will be there, and I think they'll be willing to do it. Maybe there's just a theme for me today, but sticking with that senior leader or the CEO, I think it's also important for that person to have reasonable expectations of how much people are or are not going to care about the company and about the mission. Because in an ideal world, we'd love for everybody to be fully invested and to care as much about the mission in the company as we do. But especially if you're a founder or you're a really early person in a company and you've just lived and eaten and slept this for the last 5 or 10 years, it is just not realistic for you to assume that other people are going to have that same level of commitment. And it might be nice if they do. You may find some people who that's the case. But by and large, if you are a founder or a very early leader in an organization, it's just not going to be the number one thing in everybody's life the way that maybe it has been the number one thing in your life for a long time. And if you don't make peace with that expectation, I think you're going to be constantly disappointed by people. And ultimately, you're going to have some chafing in your relationship because you're going to be like, what is with this person? Why don't they want to work till 10 o'clock every night to get this thing done? I thought we were all going to war together here. And the truth of the matter is, you get to 15, 16, 30 employees, people are going to start asking questions like, does this job come with dental? And you're just going to have to make peace with the fact that that's how people are going to operate. So I think that's also part of it, is be willing to assign people a level of responsibility and ownership that is realistically aligned with who they are and their goals and their potential rewards from the organization. And don't expect everyone to feel exactly the same way about it as you do.
Yeah. I think that's right, because what ends up happening is that I would say that if you do not empower those people and you do not equip them to take on a certain function of an organization, whatever that function is, I think the odds are is that you're probably not going to have them around. They probably won't stick around, because most people who are trying to come on board, they're trying to come on board and flex their professional acumen and actually lead, whether it's build out an HR function or whatever. Like, if we don't give them the chance to do that, it's probably not going to stick. And I think a lot of times, to your point, I think a lot of times that, you have the founder kind of isolation. Why doesn't everybody understand or feel the same way as me? But it's like, yeah, but how much have you let go of some of the control on these different things? It's awfully hard to feel a sense of ownership of something that you feel like you're just renting, or that you just get to play with for a certain amount of time in the day. And then I've got to give it back over to this individual who is certain that their way is the only way. I think that becomes really disempowering for people and disenchanting. And that's where I think you do end up getting some of the, hey, I just work here, man. Like, why would I carry the mental load? You won't entrust me with any of the load. Why do you want me to carry the emotional load?
Yeah, that's a big one. I think I also wonder too if there's not something to be said about just how seriously the CEO or the senior leader takes work and takes the business. And so again, let's just be realistic here. It would be great for the shareholders or the board or whomever if the CEO only cared about the success of this business, or the senior VP only cared about the success of this commercial division. But the truth of the matter is, these are human beings who have other things they want to get out of life, and they may have a spouse and kids and people at home. And so part of sustainability, part of being good over the long term, is putting your work in its proper perspective within your life. And I would never suggest to anybody that they shouldn't do their best or that they shouldn't care a lot about something that's been entrusted to them. You and I feel very strongly about being good stewards of all of this stuff. And I think we know enough now to know that if you want to be very effective for very long, you can't just be burning it at both ends indefinitely. So we may have to recalibrate our own perspective a little bit and say, hey, I'm going to do my very best here. I hope this really goes well. But there are other things in my life besides, this quarter's earnings call. So am I able to have a conversation with myself, with my board, with my spouse, etc., such that I can align all of us around a reasonable expectation here? Because if you are doing everything you can at work and you're falling way short at home, that's going to take a massive toll on most people, at least. And eventually that's going to erode your capabilities at work. And so the sooner you can get those things harmonized, the better. And so that might be another thing to consider, is if your head's feeling really heavy, if the burden is feeling too great, it may not be that someone else necessarily has to take some of that burden from you. It may be that you have to lift a little bit of it off yourself, because perhaps you've gotten a little bit over-indexed on just how important this is. I mean, you and I have seen enough, whether it's from the Army or from corporate America. It feels like I've got to do this, and if I don't do it, it's never going to get done, and this is critical. And then you move on, and guess what? The machine just keeps chugging without you. And it's like, man, I just gave so many years of my life to that. And it turns out like, they've already forgotten about me, and it's been 6 months. Like, that may be the case.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I like the fact that you're talking about expectations here. We often say that unstated expectations will go unmet, and that is a certainty. And so if there's not an expectation of that integration of key factors of life, if that's not an expectation that has been established by the leader, and in fact, if what is modeled is all that matters is every single project, every earnings call, every next launch initiative, all these things are what takes precedent, then I would suggest that most people aren't really down for that for the long haul. It's certainly not sustainable, as we both know. But I think that also might actually breed some more disengagement.
Yeah, it almost certainly will, because people will see it. Like, I don't want to speak for you, Brandon, but I've seen people that I know and peers of ours, as well as senior leaders that I've had when I worked in bigger companies. And I would see what their life looked like, at least to me on the surface from the outside looking in. And I would think, I don't want that for myself. And therefore, I'm not chasing after certain jobs in certain industries, because I see what they look like, again, with my limited perspective. And I hear some of my friends and colleagues and contemporaries talk about what their life is like. And I just think, I want no part of that. And so a lot of times we think we're being heroic as a senior leader by doing all this stuff. And we think we can tell our people, hey, don't do what I do. In my role, it's different, and I've just got to do this. But in your role, we want you to have good work-life balance. Like, that does not work. Whatever they see you modeling, they're going to believe is the standard. So there's that. And then they may or may not be motivated to continue to progress in the organization if they feel like, in order for me to take that director job or take that senior VP role, I'm going to have to basically quit on the rest of my life. That's not appetizing for most people. So in a roundabout way, you're actually like degrading your talent pool a little bit by doing that.
Yeah, something I'm thinking about here is how critical it is for that senior leader to ask for help.
Yeah.
That CEO, that executive director, and to really not let these things go unnamed or unnoticed, because I think that there's that tendency to kind of suffer in silence a little bit, be very stoic and kind of take it on. But I think it's really important for us as senior leaders to tap other leaders on the shoulder and say, like, I really need some help here. I really need some distribution of the emotional load. Because a lot of times what I think we see is that we see these organizations that are going through all of this change, and those senior leaders oftentimes will take on that emotional load that is associated with it. Because I know we've both been in the position where you're making decisions that really affect people's lives, whether it's what healthcare plan are we going to go with? Are we going to be able to distribute or pass along value for the 401k or the 403b? All of these different things. How do we need to shut locations down? What will that do to impact those individuals? I think this is where we need to spread a little bit of the load here and tap others on the shoulder, bring them in, and you might even declare outright, hey, we've gone through a real big season of change, or there's an awful lot going on, and I really feel like I am coming up against the extent of my endurance, if you wanted to say that, and I really need some help. Can you help me distribute some of this load? I'd like some help in carrying some of this emotional load for the organization. I mean, literally ask for help. Ask in whatever words are genuine to you. Like, those might be my words. I won't speak for anybody else, but the ability to say, like, I feel like I'm absorbing a lot, and I'm proud to do it. It's my job as a leader. Do you think that you could help me with some of these things, and maybe we can share some of this emotional load a little bit, because I'm concerned that I'm going to flame out, and I really don't want to do that. I feel like we've got too many really important things going on. I feel like we're headed in the right direction. I feel like we have the right people, and I want to be my best self, but I'm asking, can you help me a little bit with that?
Yeah, I think that's huge. I think it's not realistic to expect help with this kind of thing unless you ask for help. So the idea that you're just going to kind of curate these people and feed them some of the right stuff and resources and training, and they're just going to completely of their own volition ask to take things off your plate. I mean, it may happen, but I don't think that's a winning strategy. I think you do need to be proactive in asking for help. And it can be in a completely professional way. It can say, hey, look, we're at a point where someone else is going to have to start being primarily responsible for this, or someone else is going to have to start, going to our meetings in DC because I've got other things going on. It can look a lot of different ways, but I think if you're not asking for help, you're probably not going to get it, at least in the way that you want it. I think about this a lot, even in our own home. And I read in a blog our friend Sarah wrote recently, this idea of mental load in the house. And there's a parenting or a relationship book on this, and I can't remember the author now. I guess it doesn't matter because that's not what I'm recommending. But there's a point in the book that says women, mothers, tend to carry a disproportionate mental load for household things, meaning even if they have a job, they're still kind of the primary person who needs to know whether your daughter's got swimming today for PE and if there's a plumber coming on Thursday and those kinds of things. And one of the things I've tried to be proactive about in our house is to make sure I've got all the kids' stuff on my calendar, so I'm fully aware. Make sure I'm reading the newsletter from my daughter's second grade teacher that comes out every week, so I'm abreast of what's going on, and then leaning in and taking an active role so that my wife Jenny doesn't have to have her full-time job and all the things she's doing and be the only person in the house that knows about all this stuff. And it's not even that I'm necessarily physically doing more in terms of dishes, laundry, parent pickup, those kinds of things. I've always done a lot of that. But by me being completely engaged in the process and fully aware of these things, it still makes her life much better than when I was doing those same things, but was kind of having to be asked by her, like, can you do this? Can you do that? So there's something to be said for letting people know what's really going on and making sure that you have a clear picture of the key things that are important, because then someone can raise their hand and say, I got this one. But if you're withholding information, whether it's on purpose or not, or you're not sharing, openly with your team about what's important and all the things that are on your plate, they can't help you there. So in order for the mental load to be distributed, there's a level of awareness that first has to happen so that people can do the right thing and lean in and help you, I think.
Yeah, that's so good. I'm so glad that you brought that up and that our teammate Sarah wrote that, because I think it's so accurate. I know that our home has fallen into that as well. And I know that there's reasons why, when you're around for 3 of the first 36 months of a marriage, it kind of starts to set a tone where, kind of mom has kind of the, the knowledge hub. Mom has kind of the emotional hub of the home. It's like ask your mother, all this kind of stuff. But I do think that that's something that a lot of moms in the home kind of take on a disproportionate amount of. I think that's absolutely accurate. I think we've seen that a number of times over. And I also would just say that, and again, this is just talking from my experience. One of the hard things was that when I would come back from deployments or trips, that trying to assert myself into lifting some of that load was problematic. And so again, there needed to be some expectation, because, I basically would show up and disrupt the flow of the home. And I think that you could take that and you could expand that into, or use that as an illustration of what can happen in some of our businesses, which, you have these teams and, different people are out kind of doing their own functional area. And even though we might want people to take some of that emotional load, they might be coming in and trying to lift a little bit. And we might be like, no, you're messing up the program. Like you're not doing it the way that I would do it. Right.
100%. And I'll land the plane here as we come up on time with where you started the conversation, which was around communication, because I think that's really what it ultimately is going to come down to. You're going to have to communicate what's going on and what's important. You're going to have to communicate areas where you need help. You'll have to communicate your expectations for where you need people to step in or really own something. You need to communicate when you need help. All of that will make this so much easier, because then people aren't going to come in and disrupt the flow. They're not going to disengage from things because they think you've got them. It really does come down to communication. And I think that's the core sort of leadership trait that is required to be effective over the long haul is, tell stories, get people into the business, be clear in describing people's expectations, stay engaged and on top of things so we don't get too far down the road before we come back and adjust. It really does come down to a high degree of communication. I think if you start there, you can get to where you need to go based on the particulars of your given situation.
Yeah, and I just wanted to note, I think it's critical. Communication is both ways in this regard.
Yeah.
I think it's also just as critical if you're one of those leaders who's been tapped on the shoulder and asked to help, and you feel like you're overwhelmed, or you feel like you're also kind of running the red line. I think that is a great opportunity for us to really lay our priorities out and start to reset what actually are our priorities right now. And can we maybe reorient some things so that we can navigate through this specific time period and really create a more kind of healthy environment for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So lots, as we said from the beginning, there's a lot to chew on there. I don't know if we made it all the way to the finish line of this conversation. It's probably one that's going to be happening in perpetuity. But Mike, we appreciate the question. To all of you listening, we appreciate you tuning in. We'd love to hear your questions. So if you've got anything that you're curious about or would like to see us address here on the podcast, just send us a note to contact@appliedleadershippartners.com, and we'll see that and do our best to talk about it here. And until then, have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you soon.